Hello, everyone, and welcome to my May book review. This was kind of a crazy month. I took a week off of work and school to just kind of chill after finals were done. So I actually ended up reading 23 books and I DNF'd one. So it was a busy month for me. I got a lot done. So I have a ton of books to share. Some of them were series that I finished from last month, and then I actually ended up finishing two series in their own this month. So lots of fun stuff to talk about. So let's get into it. The very first book that I finished was an audiobook that I started in April, and this was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is a superhero novel that's set in modern times, and the theme is kind of all about revenge. All of these characters are very morally gray. There's really no good character. There's a main character, but he's not really the hero of the story. Everyone has a very compelling motivation, and you can really side with any single character in the story and defend it pretty easily. I really like the cast a lot. I think the superheroes were really, really creative, and I really like the dynamic between a lot of the characters. There's a couple few moments that I thought were fun, but for the most part, this is a pretty heavy book. And I really, like I said, I really liked how the powers were handled. I thought they were really unique. In this world, superheroes get their powers when they have a near-death experience, and some like college students, one of them is doing their thesis on superheroes, and he figures out that near-death experiences is what triggers them. So him and his friend force themselves into near death experiences to try to trigger the onset of these superpowers. That's Victor and Eli, our two main characters. And they both end up getting superpowers, and it causes people in their lives to get hurt in ways that they didn't intend. And it leads to one of them basically becoming like this martyr for superheroes, who he takes it upon himself to cure the land of superheroes. And then the other one is trying to stop him from killing all these supers. So it's a really interesting dynamic. Victor, his superpowers is he can inflict pain on people, but he can also take it away, which I think is a really unique power to give your main character, because then he can use it, especially in a story like this where the characters are morally gray, because he can use it to hurt people and help people. And I think that's very indicative of what the story is about. So I really, really like it. I would highly recommend this if you like morally gray characters, or stories where you have to determine what is right or wrong. Next, I read Eclipse, Stephanie Meyer. This is the third Twilight book. The first two entries into this series I thought were pretty easy to stomach. There's a couple red flags for sure, especially in the case of Edward, but there's nothing out of the ordinary. I try to keep in mind that these novels were released in like the mid to late 2000s, so you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, understanding what the political climate was like at that time, the social climate was like at that time. But let me tell you, this book is so problematic. This book belongs in jail, I'm telling you. And the fact that like middle schoolers were reading this, I don't know, like parents should know what their kids are reading. Like, I'm not saying that this book should be like banned in schools, that's stupid, but like they need to understand reading this that this is not a portrayal of healthy relationships. This is a portrayal of sick relationships, and this is not what they should strive for. They do not need an Edward and a Jacob in their life. Like, this is horrible. Edward is unbelievably controlling and toxic for the whole first like third of this book, and eventually he ends up chilling out. But not before Jacob literally calling Edward out for being toxic. He literally uses the word toxic. He's like, this is a toxic relationship. And I'm like, thank you, Jacob. But then Jacob goes and does the most problematic thing in the book. He literally forces himself, and I don't remember this in the movies, and I went back and like watched a couple scenes, and this does happen in the movie. He forces himself on Bella and like kisses her without her wanting it. She like tenses up and tries to push him off, but he's like huge. He's like 7 feet tall and massive, so it doesn't work. She's like this tiny little girl, and she tries to say no, but she can't because he's kissing her. And then she later, in her own like thoughts, she describes this as being assaulted by Jacob. And then, but it's never like addressed. You can't just sexually assault someone and then be like, he literally says, sorry it wasn't good for you. Like, what? And then later on, like on the way home, she punches him in the face and she breaks her hand. And then later on, Jacob says, yeah, that was pretty incredible. And then I'm like, what the fuck? After he stops kissing her, she literally says, are you done yet? And then in her inner monologue, she says, I opened my eyes and didn't fight, didn't feel, just waited for him to stop. if that's not the most if that's the most that's the most problematic thing I've ever heard. Like, this pissed me off so much reading this. And it'd be one thing if this was portrayed in a way, I mean, like I said, Bella does admit it's assault, but it's not like looked at from that angle. It's not seen as from an angle of this is one of the many traumas that Bella has had to overcome in her life. This is just like a little fucking side note on the long list of things she has to suffer in this fucking franchise. To top it all off, her cop of a dad later on, Bella tells Charlie about the assault. And Charlie's like, "Good for you, Jacob." Huh? And then Bella's like, "Dad, my hand really hurts because I punched the guy who assaulted me." And Charlie's like, "Huh, gotta learn to pick on people your own size." Charlie, you are a cop. I mean, like, maybe he's like acting a little too much like a cop, but like, what the fuck? Literally, your daughter was assaulted and you're rewarding the assaulter just because you don't like her current boyfriend. That's insane. That's insane. And then he completely dismisses all of her feelings, and dismisses the fact that she tried to defend herself because Jacob's just a nice guy. He's just a really nice guy. Charlie, truly a cop, through and through. Through and through, baby. And this isn't even the only weird thing that Jacob does in the book. Later on, Jacob threatens to kill himself if Bella doesn't kiss him. He's like about to go into battle, and he says, "Well, maybe I'll just kill myself. Maybe I'll just let myself die." And of course, this is like her childhood friend. She's fairly close to him. So she's like, even if I don't want to like marry you or like be with you, I don't want you to die. So she kisses him. And then he complains, "That wasn't a real kiss. Like, that wasn't a good enough kiss." So then they have to like make out. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm still going to kill myself because you didn't kiss me good enough." Like, what the fuck? Yeah, so it's like, you don't extort, if you really cared about Bella, like, you would not extort the people you love into giving you physical affection like this, especially in the case where like Bella doesn't want to. And she doesn't really reciprocate the kiss. Like, once it's done, Jacob's like, "And that was a real kiss. Don't you feel it too?" And then she like kind of gaslights herself into thinking she wanted this the whole time. But it's pretty clear that she didn't want it to begin with, and she didn't want it before. So it's like, I don't know what to think of this. I guess the idea is that it was like in her subconscious that she wanted Jacob this whole time, but I don't know. And then Edward comes up later, and he isn't even mad about this. He's just like, "Wow, Jacob really showed me." Like, what? No, Edward, what the fuck? Go punch him for me. Like Edward, you've got some issues, but I mean, at least you weren't like assaulting her. I mean, for the most part, the worst thing he did was like control her a little bit and not let her leave the house because he was trying to keep her safe. Like, yeah, like I said, he's controlling. He doesn't let her visit Jacob, doesn't let her do anything besides go to school. Like, one night she tries to sneak out to visit Jacob, and he like disassembles her car so that she can't go. And like, yeah, that's obviously problematic. Both of these men should be left in the dust. But if she has to pick one of the two, obviously pick the one that isn't assaulting you. And of course, that's exactly the qualities you want in like a YA romance, is the best of the worst scenario. That's how I like my romances. This book also, I'm guessing, I don't know Stephanie Meyer's history at all. I'm guessing she's like a fairly devout Christian, because this pushes like a very strong wait until marriage situation. I don't know why that is. It's also in the next book as well. I'm guessing, like I said, it's just because Stephanie's religious, or I don't know, she's trying to like push good morals on her young adult readers. Yeah, it doesn't really make sense to me. Bella is pretty insufferable in this book. She's constantly worrying that her like big ass regenerating werewolf friend or her super strong, fast, immortal vampire boyfriend is gonna die. And it's like, you're weak and slow and a notoriously clumsy human. Like, you being within like half a meter of the fucking battle is not gonna help anything, girl. Like, you're weak as fuck. Like, you going along isn't gonna help anything. It's just gonna put them in scenarios where they have to risk their life to defend you. I don't understand why she can't get like wrap her head around this. Like, just let them live their life, girl. Like, I get it, you're anxious. Like, if I was in that scenario, I'd also probably be anxious too. But from a storytelling perspective, hearing Bella just repeat this exact same sentiment over and over and over and over for 3 books, it was like really getting on my nerves by this point. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was in the other books too, but it was easier to ignore. At this point, it was really starting to stick out because she wasn't just worried about Edward. Now she's worried about Jacob too, so it was like twice as much. I annotated this book beyond belief, in an attempt to keep my sanity. And yeah, I ended up giving it 1 star because we do not support assault in this community. So, moving on. Next, I finished the series with Breaking Dawn. I ended up giving this 1.5 stars because it had much less problematic stuff in it. Its biggest problem is that it just put me to sleep. My God, this book was boring. The first two books were like watching a really funny, bad movie. It was silly and goofy and fun, and I kind of liked it. And the third one was like watching a crime being committed in front of me. And this one just felt like the 4 hour Snyder cut of like a shitty B movie that I don't give a shit about. And yeah, it was bad. But yeah, I'm happy to report this book a lot less problematic than the last one. It is still like weirdly pro-life, as if you've seen the movies, you know, Bella decides to keep her demon baby. It is also like I said, like wait until marriage, which is less of an issue because they get married, but it's still weird. And Jacob and Edward are also just weird, but that's kind of just unavoidable at this point. They don't assault her or really manipulate her at all. They try to manipulate her, but it fails. So Bella sticks to her guns in this, which I can respect. So yeah, they're all right in this. The bar's low in Twilight. Pretty much the entire last half of this book, like after she has the baby, is just really boring. They introduced this extended cast of vampires we've never heard of before this book, or maybe we've only heard in passing like once before this book. There's there is an index at the back of this book to to describe all of the different vampires that get introduced in only like the last third of this book. And it's like, this is a YA paranormal romance. The story is not that deep. This is not high fantasy. I do not need a glossary. I do not need any of that. So the fact that she felt a need to do that is just really funny. There's also a footnote at the bottom of the page that like all the characters, all the vampires come to like meet Bella and the Cullens and stuff. At the bottom, there is a footnote that says, see the index at the back. And I was like, Stephanie was so proud of the fact that she had so many characters that she needed to introduce an index. But to me, this only demonstrates how poor her writing is. With good writing, in theory, you shouldn't need a character index. Like, after high fantasy, after the first 100 pages, you shouldn't have to look at that anymore because you're so immersed in the world. And obviously, like, it's not like Stephanie has the skills to achieve that in a YA paranormal romance. So she just skipped all of that. There's like 100 different vampires, and they all have different clans and loyalties to each other. And like in 20 pages, they try to like, you know, throw all that information at you. I'll be honest, I skipped all of it. I skimmed the index to get an idea of like who was loyal to who, and that was about it. I skipped all of that. During the last 200 pages of this, I was so sick of this book. I skipped a lot of the boring sections. Go ahead, sue me. I guarantee you there was nothing valuable in any of those scenes because I read the finale and I understood 100% of it, and it didn't matter. It ends up the plot gets resolved by Alice running off screen and doing something we didn't even know she was doing. So yeah, I mean, it's really good. It's really good storytelling when the random fucking off-screen character solves the main plot of the last two books. So yeah, the whole Volturi thing was just, I could not stand it. All four of the Twilight books, especially the first, second, and this one, have ended with like this epic fantasy adventure with lives at stake, and it's like these people. I mean, obviously the Cullens aren't, but like Bella is in high school. Like, why is she flying off to Italy? Why is she flying off to Arizona? Why is she warring with fucking 1,000-year-old vampires? I don't know. It's just like, bring the stakes down a little, girl. Like, it's not that serious. Next, I ended up reading Judas Unchained. This is a sci-fi book by Peter F. Hamilton. It's the sequel to a book that I read, I don't remember what month, a while ago, February maybe. After reading The Three Body Problem, I was really craving some more sci-fi, so I decided to finish out this. It's just a duology. And I did enjoy the second book a lot more than the first one. I would say the plot felt a lot more cohesive in this. The original book followed like a dozen different characters who were all kind of doing their own thing, and they never really connected. A few of them did, but for the most part, they were all kind of doing their own thing, and they weren't really related. But by this point, the stories have kind of coalesced, and they're all working towards a similar goal or working against that same goal. So it felt like it was more tied together. And this book is extremely slowly paced. I mean, it's It's a slog to get through some parts for sure. About halfway through is when this book really started to kick off for me, which keep in mind is about 1,300 pages. I mean, these are big books. It's 1,300 pages in this world before I finally felt a connection to the plot and the characters. After that point, there was a lot of mysteries and like, who can you trust? Like, there could be, like imposters among us sort of thing, which I thought was fun. Like I said, the world's really interesting, but the writing is so slow. It's very overly descriptive, which I have a hard time staying engaged with. And it especially was obvious during like combat scenes or action scenes, because this like main fight that we've been building up to for like the entire series, and then he'll spend like 5 pages describing the scenery, the desert, the mountain ranges, the ocean, and it's like, I don't care about any of that right now. Like, aliens are invading. Like, we have more important issues than what the mountains look like right now. So I kind of just skim it and move on, because I'm like, I don't want to read all that. Also, this was something I kind of noticed while reading, but became a lot more apparent after reading reviews for the book, is that all of the female characters are pretty one note. All of the female characters are either very, very boring or very over sexualized, and there's no in between for them. And also, all of the women are young, which is kind of weird because people can make themselves youthful again in this sci-fi world. So the people are like hundreds of years old, but everyone looks like they're 20. And it's like, okay. But the men can be 50 and 60 and 40, and who cares about the men? But the women, they all have to be 20 and hot. And it was a little weird. And a lot of the mixed reviews for this book focus on that like weird sexual edge that this book has. I think Melania's story in particular ends in a very unsatisfactory way, and her whole character is like whoring herself out for information. And I liked the direction I thought her story was going in, but then they kind of just took it in a left turn, and it wasn't really what I wanted for her. And she was my favorite character in the book, so they kind of ruined her, I felt. Justine gets completely left behind, and she is one of the female characters that had a little bit more depth to her, but she gets completely left behind. There were a ton of characters in the story, and none of them got to complete their arcs in a satisfactory way. I think Ozzy's story in the first book was my favorite part. It was like the only thing keeping me keeping me willing to finish that series. And his whole journey just took a U-turn in this book, becomes almost completely irrelevant, and gets really boring, and then he gets really boring, and then the book ends. And I'm like, really? Like, this is what we did with this character? Like, he was my favorite in the first book, and I feel like he got completely ruined as well. I think with an editor and a few more revisions, this book could have been fixed, and especially Pandora Star could have been fixed. And especially maybe like a female editor who is willing to tell Peter that women can be more than like a stuck-up asshole or like a whore. Like, there's definitely a in between there. I don't know if Peter knows this. Apparently he's like a libertarian, so I don't know, he's maybe not aware of that. But anyways, I'm glad I read it. I think it was enjoyable enough, and it kept me busy for a while because it's a very long book. But I think unless you're like a die-hard sci-fi fan or really into space operas, I'd probably skip this. Next on audiobook, I listened to The Cruel Prince. This is like a semi-big TikTok book. It's like a YA romantasy. I like this book a lot more than I thought I would, which I'm starting to realize about myself, is I think I'm like, unfortunately, just a girl. So I do kind of like some of these books that are stupid. It was sold to me as a romantasy, but I would say it's probably a little closer to fantasy. Like, there's romance elements, but they're very backburnered, and it's a lot more fantasy. I think this is a really good example of how fun young adult fantasy can be. Especially after reading the nightmare of the last 2 Twilight books. This was just fun, and it was serious enough and dark enough that I could be invested in the story, in the plot, in the characters, but not so much that I felt overwhelmed or anything like that. I thought a lot of the characters were interesting, and they surprisingly had a lot of depth and interesting motivations. I'll definitely get to the sequel at some point. It's high on my list for sure. I can't wait to continue this series. I really like the dynamic between Jude and Carden, and I know Carden is like one of the shadow daddies on TikTok, so I need to learn what the hype's about. There's a lot of good court drama, a lot of good subterfuge, and there was a couple twists that totally caught me by surprise, which I would say is something that's kind of rare in the young adult genre. It reminded me in quality to something like Legendborn. It's not quite that level because it doesn't take the commentary to like the meta level of like applying the lessons you've learned to real life, but it's like one step below there. Like, if they could take the the lessons learned on that to the next level, I think this could be just as good as Legendborn. I highly recommend this for people who are just trying to get into fantasy because it's fairly light. There's a small number of characters, very easy magic to understand, or for people who already like fantasy and want something a little more lighthearted. Next, I ended up reading Mistborn Era 2. And I actually really, really like this series. I was a little nervous to start this series because I love Mistborn Era 1 so much. And I really love Vin and Ellen. For me, their romance basically carried the whole story for me. I mean, there was also a lot of interesting stuff going on, don't get me wrong, but like that was what kept me going. I was like, I gotta know what happens next with them. And I just didn't think Mistborn would be the same without them. And I definitely still miss them, but I think Wax and Wayne are just absolutely captivating. They're so funny and they have such good chemistry. And after a lot of the slower paced books that I had just read, I think it was fun to pick up something fast paced and with great world building and in a world I was somewhat familiar with, but with a good twist. And yeah, I gave the first book a pretty generous 5 stars. I really like the character arc in this. This was originally written to be just a standalone novel, and I think it stands out great as just that. Like I said, Wax's arc in this is just beautiful. It's a little cliche, but I think it's really fun, and I really, really enjoyed this. The rest of the books in the series I thought were not quite as good. I loved the characters enough, especially after the first book, to want to keep reading and enjoy the story, but it sort of starts to get a little weird. I wasn't really a fan of the direction that the romance ended up going. I like Marasai a lot, but her character growth kind of felt like a reversal from her original stance, which I'm sure was intentional. One of her early lines in the first book is, I have no problem at all letting men like you be the ones to belt on revolvers and shoot people. Does that make me a terrible traitor to my sex? And I just love that line so much. I love when women are written in a way like that. Like the woman doesn't have to be this badass who straps on a gun every time. I think there's lots of other interesting ways to write women, and unfortunately, she does end up just becoming that woman by the end of the series. Minor spoiler, I guess. It's not really a spoiler. It's pretty clear by the end of the first book, but I just it just disappointed me because I started off with such a good spot, and I wrote in my first review for the first book, I was like, I love this so much. I hope she becomes like a lawyer. Like, that'd just be awesome. And they have someone on the inside, but she's not the one slinging guns around. But then what they end up, I don't know, I won't spoil it, but I don't know. I was not happy with what they ended up doing with her character. The magic system also gets extremely expanded from where it starts in the first 2 books, and it got a little jarring in my opinion. A lot of the Western level tech I can stomach, but the magic system becomes like a crutch to expand some really weird technology that took me out of the story, and I found it kind of difficult to swallow that. I gave the second book a 4.5 stars, despite it being a little bit boring. But overall, it was a good character exploration, I think. And then the third book I gave 3.5 stars because I didn't like what they did with the romance, and I don't know. It was just the story was like interesting, but I didn't care that much. But I do think Brandon wrapped the series up nicely with the Lost Metal. It ties up most of the loose ends while still leaving enough to kind of ponder and leave a good spot for Mistborn Era 3. It was a lot more captivating than the middle chunk of the series, which, like I said, was kind of boring. And I just I can't help but to wish this was a little less Cosmere focused, which sounds kind of crazy, but it felt like an MCU movie where they're setting up all these other characters and worlds and realms and whatever. And a lot of them, or at least a fair few of them, are pretty insignificant to this story. They're kind of like cameos, or like, this person's now going to get their own movie. And I was like, okay. I ended up giving this 4.5 because, like I said, I was really invested in the characters by this point, and by the 4th book, like, Branderson can do whatever the fuck he wants. Like, I'd still love it. Except make Wax go with Steris instead of Marasai. That's the only thing he did that I would not have approved, which he did, and I didn't approve. Speaking of the Cosmere, in between Lost Metal and Bands of Mourning, I read Mistborn: The Secret History. This is Mistborn 3.5. It takes place between the end of the 3rd book in Mistborn and the beginning of the first book in Mistborn Era 2. I ended up giving it 4 stars. There's not much to really say about this. It's all spoilers for the original trilogy and minor spoilers for this series. So it's good. I liked it enough. It's not really a story. It's kind of just like explaining the plot. And it's like, where has this character been? But I like Kel a lot, so I didn't really care that there wasn't much of a story. And it's very Cosmere focused. It's basically like Kell's Guide to the Cosmere. So it's kind of interesting. I would definitely read Stormlight before you read this, and probably even the other series as well, Mistborn Era 2. There's lots of Cosmere stuff in this that's revealed that, not that it won't make sense, but like you'll get more out of it if you've read Stormlight. But I guess the same could be said the other way. If you read this and then read Stormlight, you'll understand some other parts of Stormlight. So next, I started to read Xenos by Dan Abnett as an audiobook. This is a Warhammer 40k storybook. Not my cup of tea. This is like for diehard 40k fans, was kind of my interpretation in it. I went into it wanting to learn more about the setting and how Inquisitors work, because I think the setting's semi-interesting, but I don't really have an interest in like reading the rule books or like diving into wikis. So I was like, maybe like a narrative format would be good, but this was definitely written for people who already understood 40k material and understand how the world works and understand a lot of the terminology that's being used. It was pretty mediocre. I've read about 60% of it. It was very mediocre as far as like sci-fi goes. And I think even just a regular sci-fi book is a little bit of a harder sell for me. It's not my favorite. So if you're a 40k fan, I think you will like this. But if you're not, you'll probably be confused and a little bit bored like me. So I just felt like this wasn't worth my time. And I was really zoning out every time I tried to listen to this. So maybe I'll try it later in a physical form. I think I'll probably do better. Next, in one sitting, I read Funny Story by Emily Henry. This was her new release. It came out like about a month ago. I will always eat up anything Emily Henry writes. This book was fun and it was sexy and it was such a good time. I think Miles is a really fun love interest and he's got just enough depth to be compelling, but he felt realistic. He makes a few choices towards the end of the book, sort of like a third act breakup almost, that set off a few red flags, but it was all right. He apologizes and he handled it like an adult, so I can look away from that. If I was Daphne looking into those beautiful brown eyes, I'd probably forgive him too. I am a sucker for the fake dating trope, which this has, and I think it always just creates good tension between the characters, and this book is like a perfect example of how to pull off the fake dating trope. It just felt like watching a rom-com in all the best ways, and yeah, very fun. Like I said, if you like romance, pick up all of the Emily Henry books, except for the one I will also talk about later. They're all great except for that one. Next, also in one sitting, I finally read Tress. I was waiting to read Mistborn Era 2 before I picked this up. I don't know if that was really necessary. I don't think there's that many Mistborn references in this. I think just by reading the first book, I would have understood what was going on. But so the main character, Tress, she is from a small island that she is legally never allowed to leave. She also happens to be in love with the Duke's son, Charlie, who is now being swept away by his father to go find a bride to be married to. And Tress is eagerly waiting for the Duke's son to return, but the Duke comes back without the man Tress loves. And she asks around and finds out that he was sent on this lethal journey to visit the sorceress in the Midnight Sea, the most dangerous sea to sail. So Tress sets off on this beautiful, fantastical, dangerous quest with pirates and dragons and sorceresses, and it's amazing. Brandon Sanderson world building, and she is going to go save her man. It's so good. It's kind of like a retelling of The Princess Bride, if you can kind of get that from the synopsis there. This was just so fun to read. If you know anything about the Cosmere, then saying that it's a story told from Hoyd's perspective should be enough to sell it to you. If that means nothing to you, then don't read this book until you read more Cosmere stuff and you know who Hoyd is. But yeah, this is so fun. It's like got meta commentary from Hoyd, who's talking about, he's basically telling you the story that he experienced long ago. And if you liked those scenes in Stormlight, and I think there's one, I just read something recently there's one in Warbreaker where he does the same thing and he like sits down and he tells a cute little story. It's basically just the full length version of one of those. It isn't necessary to know the Cosmere to understand the story for sure, but there's just so many fun little Easter eggs and so many fun little references that I think you just won't get the same out of it as if you knew it. I've seen this marketed as like a cozy fantasy, and I would say it's adjacent to that, but it's a little darker than what I would call a cozy fantasy. Whimsical is the term that Brandon uses to describe it, and I would agree with that. I would say it's closer to like a whimsical fantasy than cozy. I absolutely love this. I laughed out loud a lot while reading it. It's super witty and it's fourth wall breaking, and I had absolutely no hesitation giving this the 5 stars it deserves. I think this is one of Brandon's best works, for sure. Super fun. So, like what I was talking about with Cruel Prince, how I found out I'm really just a girl like everyone else. I read the ACOTAR series, the entire series, like in 2 weeks. It was really, really good. I went into this knowing that it was the most popular book series on TikTok, probably the most popular book series in my age group, or at least with women in my age group. And despite my expectations were really low, I try to avoid those like super crazy popular books, just because I think they're usually people I respect who end up reviewing them usually say they're pretty mediocre. Like they're not bad usually, but pretty mediocre, or they are really bad in the case of someone like Colleen Hoover. So I try to avoid them when I can. But I requested this on Libby, and it had like a half a year wait. So I was like, sure, I'll just wait, see what happens. It ended up only taking like 2 months, and yeah, let's talk about ACOTAR. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, but I'm sure it won't be quick. I do want to do a spoiler review of the entire series and kind of like break down the plot and everything in the future. So keep an eye out for that. It'll probably be a while. I've just started writing it. But I was so surprised by this book. The bar was set so low, but it superseded anything that I expected from it by like tenfold. I pretty recently had just read Twilight, so I was kind of expecting that level of prose, that level of detail, that level of characters and world building. And I wasn't too far off on some aspects of it, but this is so much better than Twilight. So much better. Twilight wishes it was this book. Um, I did not take this book too seriously, and I don't think it should be taken seriously. There are some hardcore fans out there on TikTok, and I think they're a little silly. Like, don't get me wrong, it's fun to be a fan of these books, but I would say this is a read it and forget it sort of series. Unfortunately, my TikTok feed has found out that I've read this series, and now it's all I see, so I will not be forgetting it anytime soon. I had a blast with literally every single book in this series, and this is the fastest I think I've ever read. I mean, these books are not skinny. And when I was reading them on my Kindle, I was like, oh, they must be big font. Because, like, I've seen the books, they're huge, but, like, I'm reading them so fast. I mean, they are very normal font and, like, margin sizes. These are not anything out of the norm in terms of formatting, and I was just breezing through them. The writing level is something probably equivalent to like a late middle school or a high school reading level, which I think is what makes it go through so fast. I just breezed through them. The first book was very entertaining and very fun. I would say it's the most forgettable. Well, that's not true. It's the second most forgettable. I ended up giving it 4 stars because it was fun. I was interested. It got me invested in the characters, but it wasn't anything to write home about, I guess. The second book in the series, Court of Mist and Fury, is definitely where the series peaks. The banter that Reese and Feyre have, I think, is super hot and it's super funny, and they have great chemistry. I think this book portrays trauma and PTSD in a very compelling way, and especially when I was comparing it to Twilight, which tries to depict Bella with depression. That was just boring and very surface level. In this book, although it maybe isn't the most accurate exploration of it, I think it tries to do something more than like what Twilight did, and I think it deserves some credit for that. It also does a really fun reversal of expectations from the first book, which I knew it was coming because I had been spoiled on TikTok, but I think this was a solid 4.5 book for sure. There's a few glaring issues, which I will talk about in my full book review, because they're spoilers, but I if those were resolved, this would definitely be a 5-star book. I mean, those had a 5-star feeling. I think I read this in 2 days. Most of these books I read in 1 or 2 days. I mean, it was so fun. After this book, the series kind of stagnates a little bit. At this point, the main couple is together, so it's a little hard to write what is basically a romance-focused series without the romance, like the romance is finished. So this means that the fantasy side of the series has to kind of take the spotlight. I felt like the fantasy was pretty underused in the previous books. It had always been kind of a plot device, or something like, rather than an interesting addition to the world. And I ended up giving this 4 stars because it was still really entertaining. Like I said, the fantasy side of it got to come forward, and I think it was fun. I can see why people like this more than Silver Flames, which I don't agree with, but I can see why they would think that because, yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this. Then Sarah made an interesting decision. She wrote this like weird novella. This is like the Christmas special episode of ACOTAR. It was mostly just boring. It was kind of weird. I only ended up giving it 2.5 stars. This is the first time Moss experiences with multiple POVs. So each chapter is a different character for the most part. And I found it mostly just confusing because for the first, like, I mean, for all of the, for all of this, it's been first person from Feyre's point of view. So now we're switching characters and it's confusing. I keep thinking I is Feyre when I is Cassian or Nesta, and then I feel like, who the fuck is talking right now? And I kept getting confused, which is maybe my fault. I was reading it late at night, but I don't know. This is just an experiment for what she ends up doing in the next book, Silver Flames, and then it was also to set up the romance between Nesta and Cassian. But I felt like this definitely could have been skipped. Like they end up even doing a very similar scene in this, and it's meant to like show Nesta's growth, but I feel like they could have just included this in, like trim out the fat of this, include it in the beginning of this book, and why does this exist? Just to sell more books? I don't know. It's stupid. I hate this. Next, although the series isn't finished, this is the last book that's released, and this focuses on a different set of characters. So before it was mainly like Feyre Reese or like Feyre Tamlin, and this is Nesta and Cassian, which means nothing to you if you haven't read these books, but they're like the side characters that finally get the spotlight, and I think that was definitely the right decision. I haven't read other series of romances, but I know this is basically what they end up doing is they spend time with the main couple until people get bored, and then they move on to like side characters and make them become a couple. And like I said, that was the right decision. At this point, Feyre and Reese's story has been told. If you kept focusing on them, it would be redundant, or you'd have to like fabricate issues in their relationship, which would just be boring. So I'm glad that Nesta and Cassian got the spotlight in this. I think it was really fun to watch them fall in love. This book was a lot more steamy than the other ones, but it tried to have a plot. I would say this has the least amount of plot, probably, than any of the books, which makes it a little weird, but it was still enjoyable, and I like these characters a lot. But again, I had less attachment to them just because I've spent so much time with the other characters and a lot less time with these. So I still give it 4 stars. And like I said, I like these characters. I like all of the characters in this world at this point, so I'm a lot less critical of the story. I think I'll talk about it more in my full review, but the prose definitely gets better. In this book, I didn't say this, but this book was written in third person, while the others were all in first, which was absolutely the right move to make when you're trying to introduce all these new characters and take a more fantasy-focused spin. Switch to third person like a lot of high fantasy does. So yeah, I think this was a good experiment, and it was a successful experiment, and now we'll get like Elaine and Lucian's story, or Elaine and Azriel's story, or whoever ends up being next. But I really enjoyed this series as a whole. I give it 4 stars. I think with maybe another good book, this could maybe be 4.5 star series. I don't know. Next, I ended up reading Project Hail Mary. This is by the same author who wrote The Martian. If you've seen that Matt Damon movie, this is the same author. I had a really good time reading this book. It was very tense, but really heartwarming and pretty funny. It was a lot more character focused than any of the other sci-fi books that I read, which I think made me enjoy it a lot more. It's a sci-fi, but that's kind of like, I don't know, it's not really the background, but it's all about the characters and their feelings and their emotions, almost like a literary fiction, kind of. Um, I would say go into this book completely blind. The main character has amnesia, and he is slowly recovering his memories throughout the book. And I think if you go in blind, you can just go along with him through that journey. And if you have no background, you'll feel just like a character in the story. And I would say even if you haven't liked sci-fi stories in the past, like try this. It's getting a Ryan Gosling movie in a couple years. It's filming right now, and this is character focused. And while there is definitely sci-fi stuff where they talk about math and whatever, the main character is a high school science teacher. So he explains stuff like he would to his 8th grade science students. And it's perfect. So yeah, you should read this. 100%. I gave it 5 stars. Next, I ended up reading Circe. This is another Madeline Miller book, same author of Song of Achilles. There is just something about Madeline Miller's writing style that is just perfect for the tone that she was going for in this book. I just love her writing style so much. Her tone has this sort of like omniscient first person, almost like you're being told a story and the narrator knows how it ends. This story was beautiful and it was tragic, and it's a really beautiful reimagining of the Odyssey. Circe is one of those characters that you relate to wholeheartedly, and you feel a little embarrassed about it because she's a very flawed person. I have so much empathy for her. Like, her story is told in such a compelling way, and it's so beautiful. Like, I love her so much. I love Circe. I couldn't decide. It's somewhere between a 4.5 and a 5 stars. Um, I I guess 4.75. I don't know. Next, I read People We Met on Vacation. This is the last Emily Henry book that I hadn't read yet. And I heard it was the worst, and consensus was correct. This is about Poppy and her best friend Alex. They spend every single summer going on vacations together around the world. But something happened 2 years ago, which left her and her best friends on rocky ground. And in an attempt to rekindle their friendship, they go on another vacation for the first time in 2 years, and they have to confront their feelings for each other. Uh, it's definitely her weakest book. I didn't even really care about the couple. I think the framing of the story with the flashbacks on the previous vacations was kind of disconnected from the story. I don't know. I needed a few rewrites, I think, in my opinion. Uh, I think a lot of the flashbacks probably could have been cut, which would have left more room to show the current time where the couples are connecting, because I felt like most of the time they didn't even really care about each other. I don't know. And then there was like a third act breakup in this book, which was extra bad. I mean, I always hate them. They're always the worst part of romance novels. But the fight in this just didn't make any sense to me. Like, Alex gets mad for almost no reason. I mean, he could have just, like, they could have just had an adult conversation. And, like, these people are supposed to be, like, I forget how old they are, but I want to say they're, like, close to 30. I mean, they both have full-time jobs. They're living their full adult lives. I don't know. He just seems to get no mad, and then he holds a grudge for way longer than seems necessary. It was still enjoyable, so I gave it 3 stars. I mean, I still enjoyed it enough, but I don't know. It just felt like it felt unfinished. And from my understanding, I believe this is her first book, so that checks out. Her editor wasn't as good yet. Next, on audiobook, I listened to Everything I Know About Love. This was, I don't know what this book was. I think it was trying to be a self-help book in the format of a memoir. I appreciate the message of this book. At its core, it's about, learning to love yourself for who you are, accepting yourself for who you are, learning not to focus on the romantic relationships in your life, but the friendships that are full of love. And I think that was all good. But this advice is focused on for maybe 20% of the book at the end. And this advice felt thought out and based on experience, and it was quite valuable, I think. But the rest of this book is just moments from the author's adolescence and her 20s. And it was interesting to see someone who has fairly similar anxieties to myself, and they approached their problems in like the opposite way as to I would approach them. Um, but their journey was not relatable. I guess you could say it was educational, but I would never even consider doing the things that she had done. And so it wasn't like, don't make the same mistakes I did, because I would never make those mistakes. I make different ones. I don't know. And it definitely removed any FOMO I've had about like not being a partier in high school or college. Like sometimes I'm like, I wonder, like, did I miss out on like my teens? No, reading this book, I did not. I didn't miss out on anything useful. I felt pretty disconnected from these anecdotes. I didn't really relate to them. I wasn't invested in this author's story. And like I said, it wasn't really until the advice section around the last 20% that it felt like it actually pulled the threads together, and it felt this book had the impact that it was trying to have. I think if they maybe would have sporadically laid them out more, and they tried to, there was like some weird, but I don't know. It didn't work for me. I ended up giving it 2.5 stars, which thinking back on it is maybe a little generous. Next, I read Educated by Tara Westover. This was recommended by Lexi Newly Nova here on YouTube. This is like one of her favorite books, and I was like, well, sign me up. This is a beautiful and powerful memoir about the cycle of abuse and self-determination and the power of education. Tara paints a raw picture of what her childhood looked like and what the emotional ramifications of trying to cope with the trauma that she faced. It was dark and very frustrating to read at times. It's like all of these adults in her life were just oblivious and incompetent, and if they weren't the ones performing these awful acts, they were enabling them. So it was frustrating, but it was also, by the end, it was inspiring. It was very emotional. This is definitely a book that I'm gonna think about for a long time. Basically, Tara's parents were very strict, conservative Mormons. The dad was also, I don't think he ever got officially diagnosed, but we're fairly certain he had bipolar disorder and potentially schizophrenia. He's very paranoid about the government, and he was like a doomsday prepper. And yeah, so he was like a little nutso, and all of the kids were off the grid. Half of them didn't have birth certificates, none of them really went to school. And yeah, so it's like her trying to break out of that shell of like this very small world and finding out what the rest of it is like. And yeah, it was very, very, very powerful. Last, I read Dear Jacob, A Mother's Journey of Hope on audiobook. This is a memoir written by Jacob Wetterling's mom after the case was solved. If you don't know, Jacob Wetterling was abducted less than half a mile from his home when he was 13, and then he was never seen or heard from again until 28 years later when they recovered his body. This is a local story for me. It's haunted my hometown, my local area for years, and I vividly remember like where I was and what was happening when the news broke that his body was discovered. I think this story was super interesting as a local true crime story. I think Patty's depiction of trying to cope with this horrible event and like what do you do as a mother when something like this happens that's outside of your control, it made this book worth reading for sure. I would say a few times she gets off topic, uh, but overall, I would say the story was on track and it kept moving and it was interesting. The co-author, Joy Baker, she really surprised me with her writing abilities. It's fairly clear, even in audiobook, when it's Patty versus when it's Joy, or like when Joy's little hand got in there and tweaked some stuff that Patty wrote. Her background is in a true crime blogger, and I think that the parts of the book that are more true crime focused were definitely more interesting to me, and those I can tell with the parts that Joy wrote. She was a blogger during the time, or she was the blogger that basically broke the story, like 20 years or something, I forget exactly, after the case went cold and no one was looking at it. She was the one that kept looking into it, interviewing suspects, brought new evidence to the police, and eventually led to the arrest of the man who did it. She's basically the crux of what made this case possible to solve. I think that's really powerful that she then got to work with Patty on writing this memoir. I would say the weakest parts of this were the more emotional moments. At the beginning, they were very, very impactful, for sure. But after a while, they got a little repetitive. I mean, I understand that Patty was going through hell for the 28 years it took for her to find out what happened to Jacob finally. It was very inspiring that they held on to hope pretty much the entire time. Like they still were fairly insistent on the fact that they could find Jacob alive, kidnapped somewhere. One thing that really surprised me was Patty Wetterling's involvement in politics. I never knew Jacob Wetterling's mom like ran for Senate and House in Minnesota, and I think this section of the book where she's talking about all her lobbying and her political efforts will probably be a lot less interesting to a lot of people, and it's probably the parts they don't like. But for me, as someone who's interested in politics, I found this very interesting. And also another thing that shocked me multiple times, I went, wow, what the fuck, was some of the questions that journalists were asking the Wetterling family after Jacob's abduction. Like some of these questions, can't think of any examples, but just such a lack of respect for what these people are going through, pushing them to answer very personal questions and asking questions framed as if Jacob was already dead even a week after his disappearance. I don't know, things that you shouldn't be asking as a journalist. Like if you're trying to get what the parents are going through, ask them open-ended questions, not these weird, narrow, like aggressive, accusatory questions. It was just appalling the things that they got asked. And although this story doesn't have a happy ending, obviously it was still really interesting to learn kind of what the process was like. I mean, he was abducted 20 years before I was born, so it was interesting to learn, what it was like during that time. There was tons of national and local support. So if, I wasn't around for, I was a kid. So that's kind of a sour note to end on. But I really enjoyed this month of reading. I had a ton of fun. I went through a ton of books and I had a good mishmash of sci-fi and fantasy and literary, and yeah, it was like a good mix. I mean, obviously more fantasy heavy because that's my interest, but I'm trying to get a smattering of different genres. I'm currently listening on audiobook to a thriller, which I haven't read before, so I'm excited for that. It's kind of interesting so far. Like I said, I'm working on a full ACOTAR review. I have a full Stormlight Archive review as well, which I'll probably just wait until the fifth book comes out and lump it all in one. But yeah, I've got some things in the work. Now that school's done, I have a little bit more time to do stuff like this. So yeah, this was a lot of fun. See you next month. Bye. Boo.